Hello. I want to say a couple of things about test cutting. I'm not going to say a huge amount because there are many things that could be said about it, and it would be too much to put into a short video. I like to keep these relatively short. So what is test cutting? Essentially it's taking a sharp sword, such as this Albion ringneck, and using it to cut things. It's basically as simple as that. Why do we do this? Well, it's part of what I call the great triangulation. That is, using different tools and different training methods to gain a better understanding of how swords were actually used, or any other weapon were actually used. So test cutting, if you search for test cutting on YouTube or on Google, you'll find loads and loads of results, and there's lots to watch, and it's worthwhile watching some of these videos to get an idea of the different ways that different people do things. Fundamentally, I think that in the first place, when people started reconstructing historical European martial arts about 20 years ago, the people who first brought in test cutting into the European practice were probably inspired by the Japanese test cutting that's done with tatami mats, quite famously so, and you can see some excellent examples on YouTube. However, and this was, in a way, this was levelled at them as a criticism, saying this is a Japanese practice and it doesn't really have a place in European swordsmanship. Well, the first thing I'll say is it absolutely does, because it features very prominently in Victorian martial arts. So people who are longsword or medieval centric, they have a hard time defending this point that test cutting is an oriental practice in European martial arts. But actually, those of us who also do Victorian arts don't have a problem at all, because several of the Victorian treatises, most famously John Musgrave Waite's manual, which is hosted on Schola Gladiatoria's website at the moment, has a whole load of different cutting exercises, or cutting feats, should we call, sword feats they were known as, to show your cutting prowess. But not only was this done as a display to impress the public and other practitioners, it was also done as an actual practice to make you a better swordsman in the Victorian period. So it was definitely done in a European context. Whether test cutting for test cutting's sake was done in medieval Europe, the jury's out on that one. There's a little bit of evidence, but it's a difficult one to support. It was certainly done in one form or another in the Middle East, because we know from Persian and Egyptian furusaya, I believe they're called, essentially treatises on the use of weapons and riding, and they show forms of cutting clay, for example, and some people have reconstructed this. Mike Edelson, for example, has done clay cutting in recent times, and in the last few months in fact. So going back to the point, essentially, so test cutting is something that has come into European martial arts. It did exist in European martial arts originally, certainly in the later period stuff. What is it useful for? Well, so the people who say that test cutting doesn't need to be done or isn't important claim that if you practice fencing and you practice your forms well enough, then you'll be able to cut well. Okay, sometimes that's true. However, in my observation, in however many years I've been doing HEMA, over 15 years now, that's not always true. And I've seen people who are experienced fencers, and people I respect, and good teachers, good fencers, and they are rubbish when it comes to cut. Now that doesn't necessarily mean that they can't cut a tatami mat or a water bottle or whatever they're cutting. However, what it does mean is that when they come to cut, their form goes to pieces. And for me, this is the usefulness, the most useful part of test cutting. It's that you should cut when you're test cutting as you would cut when you're fencing or when you're training a technique. Okay? So that means if you've trained to make a nice small movement with the sword in your drill, that means that when you go to cut the bottle, you shouldn't need to take a massive great swing to do it. Okay? Now that's not to say there's nothing wrong with big great swings. Certainly a longsword cutting from posta di donna or vomtag is fine. You know, we know that exists. But you should also be able to cut in other scenarios, not only cut once as well, but cut repeatedly. So my plea really to people doing test cutting is try and think about not just cutting a bottle or cutting a tatami mat or cutting a piece of pig or whatever you're cutting, but try and cut in a way that's martially valid, in a way that you could cut in a fight. And don't just practice the big sweeping cuts, but also practice the small cuts, the push cuts, the draw cuts, cutting from a bind, cutting one target immediately after another one. And in some of my videos that I've got on this channel, that's what I try to do when I put multiple targets up. I try to start from a guard position, cut one target, cut another target, and then finish in the guard position. So bear that in mind when you're watching cutting videos, and don't be afraid to be a bit more critical, because I think in HEMA we can afford to try and push for slightly better standards in test cutting. But I do believe it's a very worthwhile activity, and it's good fun at the end of the day. Thank you.